What if the deadliest threat on the battlefield wasn't enemy fire, artillery, or gas, but the ground beneath your feet, silently deciding who would live and who would vanish forever? At first, the men joked about it. "It's just mud," they said, brushing off the thick brown paste that clung to their boots like a living thing. But within hours, those same men would watch the earth open like a mouth and swallow soldiers whole, leaving nothing behind but a helmet, a ripple on the surface, or a scream cut short, as if the air itself had been devoured. It began subtly, almost innocently. A single soldier lagging behind, sinking slightly deeper with each step, while the others marched on. No one imagined that a routine advance across a familiar stretch of no man's land would become a descent into a nightmare where nature behaved like a predator. The ground looked harmless from a distance, flat, wet, glistening under the overcast sky, but up close it shifted, breathed, and trembled in ways that defied logic. The first disappearance happened so fast that the men didn't process it. A corporal took one wrong step. His boot plunged into what looked like a shallow puddle, and suddenly he was knee-deep, then waist, sinking as if dragged downward by invisible hands. His comrades grabbed his arms and rifles, pulling with everything they had, but the mud tightened around him like a vice, refusing to release its hold. One moment he was there, screaming for help, and the next the muck rose over his chest, then his neck, then his face, until silence replaced his voice, as though the ground had claimed him as its own. The rescuers stared in disbelief, frozen in a moment they could not rationalize, unable to understand how a battlefield they had crossed dozens of times could transform into something predatory. At first, the officers insisted it was an isolated incident, an unfortunate mix of rain, shell craters, and unstable soil. But the men knew better. They felt the tremors beneath their boots, heard strange sucking sounds when they marched, and noticed how the mud seemed thicker, darker, almost alive. Stories spread rapidly across the trenches. Tales of soldiers walking alone at dusk and disappearing without a trace, of rifles found standing upright in the mire with no bodies attached, of boots pulled clean off as if the earth wanted trophies. Even the bravest veterans lowered their voices when speaking about the devourer, a nickname whispered with the same fear once, reserved for enemy snipers. Still, the commanders ordered another push across the same sector, refusing to believe that Mud could halt an entire advance. The morning of the operation, fog covered the battlefield like a burial shroud. Visibility was barely 5 feet. The air smelled of wet earth and gun oil. As the platoons stepped out, the ground responded instantly. Every footstep felt heavier than the last. Every movement resisted, as though the battlefield itself wanted the men to stay exactly where they were. A machine gun burst cracked through the fog, and soldiers instinctively dove for couvre-feu to realize too late that the soft ground did not support them. Some dropped to their knees and found themselves unable to rise. Others crawled and felt the mud grip their elbows like claws. Panic spread faster than the gunfire. The nightmare escalated when entire lines of soldiers began sinking simultaneously, their weight triggering collapses in the weakened terrain below. The earth swallowed them in slow motion, pulling them down inch by inch, while their comrades desperately tried to drag them free. The more they struggled, the faster they disappeared. Harnesses snapped, ropes tore through their fingers, and the suction grew stronger as if feeding on their fear. One soldier described it later as watching the land inhale us. Another survivor claimed he felt something pulling from below. Not just mud, but pressure force like a hidden void beneath the surface, waiting for victims. By midday, The truth was undeniable. The battlefield had become a death trap with rules no soldier had ever trained for. Every step forward risked sinking into oblivion. Every attempt at rescue risked adding another name to the list of the vanished. Commands turned into chaos. Formations collapsed, and the line between solid ground and lethal terrain blurred until even officers hesitated to move. And yet the men couldn't retreat, not while the fog concealed everything, not while they remained unaware of where the next void would open beneath their feet. It was the kind of terror that didn't roar like artillery or strike like bullets. It whispered. It waited. It chose its moment. And just when the soldiers believed they had identified the worst of it, the ground shifted again, this time in a direction they hadn't anticipated, as if something beneath the surface was no longer satisfied with taking isolated victims, but was beginning to reshape the battlefield entirely. Before we push deeper into what happened next on that cursed battlefield, take a moment to really think about what you've just witnessed here. Understanding this kind of hidden military reality is the key to seeing history without the filters, without the simplifications, without the comfortable stories we're so used to hearing. And if this part of the story shocked you, the next one will push even further into the tactics, the mistakes, and the terrifying truths that shaped these soldiers' final moments. So before we continue, let me ask you something important. What detail in this opening struck you the most? Leave a comment with your thoughts. Your perspective helps bring these forgotten events back to life. And while you're here, make sure you hit the like button so the algorithm knows this is the kind of history that deserves to be told. Also, check if you're subscribed. You won't want to miss what comes next, because the deeper we go, the darker this story becomes. The soldiers thought they were dealing with just another stretch of ruined battlefield terrain, moody, unpleasant, but familiar. They had crossed worse landscapes before, but nothing in their training prepared them for a place where the ground behaved like an unpredictable living organism. Beneath the surface lay a deadly mixture of shattered earth, waterlogged clay, pulverized chalk, and decomposing organic matter churned repeatedly by relentless shellfire. Each explosion had rearranged the landscape, compressing some areas into hard crusts, while hollowing others into fragile pockets that collapsed under the slightest weight. The result was a terrain that looked stable from above but hid a labyrinth of liquefied soil and vacuum-like voids ready to give way under an unsuspecting soldier. The men quickly learned that the muddy surface was only the mask. Underneath, the layers of soil no longer followed natural patterns. Bombardments had turned the battlefield into a patchwork of geological fractures, saturated beyond capacity by weeks of rain. Every step compressed the ground differently, creating oscillations that spread outward like ripples, sometimes triggering collapses several feet away. Officers described the phenomenon as a battlefield built on lungs, the earth inhaling and exhaling under pressure, waiting for the moment it would finally sink. Even engineers, hardened by years of building under fire, admitted they had never seen the land behave with such instability. Then came the realization that the danger was not uniform. Some areas were relatively safe, offering solid footing for brief moments. Others were deadly traps, disguised under only a few inches of soft soil. Soldiers became hyper-aware of every sensation. The sudden coldness of water seeping into their boots, the faint vibration when they shifted weight, the eerie silence that sometimes fell moments before the ground gave way. Veterans who had survived artillery barrages and machine gun nests confessed they feared this terrain more than any enemy they had ever faced. At least a sniper revealed his position with a flash. The mud revealed nothing until it swallowed you whole. By this point, commanders demanded explanations. Military geologists dragged into the chaos, analyzed samples, and delivered a disturbing assessment. The ground was entering a state known as soil liquefaction, a condition normally associated with earthquakes but here triggered by relentless bombardment and continuous troop movements. The explosive force shattered the soil structure, allowing water to fill every microscopic gap. Under pressure, the solid earth transformed into something closer to thick fluid. On paper, it was a scientific phenomenon. In reality, it created a battlefield where the difference between standing and disappearing could be a single misplaced footstep. But even this explanation didn't capture the full horror. The collapse zones were not static. They expanded with movement, pressure, and even sound vibrations. Marching columns unknowingly activated chain reactions beneath the surface, causing distant pockets to cave in without warning. Soldiers attempting to rescue others often triggered secondary collapses, turning acts of bravery into additional tragedies. The terrain had become an unpredictable maze of shifting death pits, making every decision advance, retreat, or even stand still a gamble with fatal stakes. What? Magi! This nightmare, even worse, was that nature wasn't acting alone. Human warfare amplified every weakness of the land. Artillery shells didn't merely wound soldiers, they reshaped the battlefield into something monstrous. Trenches collapsed into slurry-filled trenches. Bunkers were buried under tons of liquefied soil. Communication lines vanished overnight as the earth consumed cables, runners, and sometimes entire teams sent to repair them. It was as if the war itself had created a new enemy, a terrain so unstable that both sides feared stepping onto it. And yet, orders continued to come, despite warnings, despite losses, despite the haunting knowledge that the ground was as lethal as rifle fire. Soldiers were pushed forward again and again, because the high command still believed the mud was just smoothed-on inconvenience, not a battlefield predator. That disbelief would cost countless lives in the days to come, especially once the enemy realized that this cursed terrain could be turned into a weapon far deadlier than machine guns. The moment commanders realized the terrain itself was killing more men than rifles or shrapnel, they scrambled to improvise a solution. Soldiers couldn't simply avoid the zone. It stretched unpredictably across the front line, sometimes shifting by dozens of meters overnight. So the military did what it always does in crisis. It tried to engineer a way through hell. Wooden planks, scrap metal sheets, broken doors from abandoned farmhouses, even shattered. Wagon parts were hauled to the front lines to create makeshift pathways across the treacherous mud, but the ground beneath them was too unstable. The moment weight pressed down, planks bowed, cracked, or simply sank like stones. Within minutes, carefully constructed paths disappeared under churning liquid earth. Engineers then attempted something more ambitious. They assembled lattice of interlocking boards, hoping to spread the weight across a wider surface. At first, it seemed promising until a column of troops advanced, and the entire structure folded inward like a collapsing skeleton. The men screamed as they were dragged into the hole the boards created, their equipment fastening them to the sinking mass. Witnesses described a horrifying chain effect. One collapse triggered another, and then another, until the entire forward line was plunging knee-deep, chest-deep into the mire, while enemy machine guns opened fire from concealed positions. Under these conditions, even basic movement became an act of survival. Soldiers learned to listen for certain sounds. A faint bubbling beneath the surface meant the soil was shifting. A soft snapping sound indicated an underground cavity was giving way. A sudden silence meant that pressure was building and collapse was imminent. But these warnings didn't always comic. Sometimes the ground betrayed them without the slightest hint. A soldier walking confidently, 1 second would vanish up to his hips, the next, his frantic cries, drowned out by gunfire and the sound of comrades struggling to reach him. Realizing that this swampy terrain effectively froze entire battalions in place, commanders considered retreat. But retreat required crossing the same deadly terrain, again and under concentrated enemy fire. The enemy, noticing the chaos, began timing their attacks precisely when troops were most stuck. If soldiers paused to pull someone out, enemy shells rained down. If they attempted to sprint across, the weight triggered collapses. The battlefield became a sickening intersection of human desperation and tactical exploitation. In one desperate attempt to break the stalemate, engineers brought forward bundles of brushwood, hoping that layering them across the surface would create a primitive mat strong enough to distribute weight. It was a technique once used in medieval bogs, but this battlefield was different. The mud was too saturated, the cavities too deep, and the bombardment too relentless. The brushwood sank within minutes, swallowed before a single company could cross. Not even horses could help. Cavalry units that tried to pull the trapped men out ended with their mounts stuck, screaming, and eventually drowning beneath the surface. Then came the rope lines. Soldiers tied themselves together so that if one fell in, the others could haul him back. But the ground was stronger. In several documented cases, entire squads were dragged into sinkholes as the suction pulled them forward. Knife blades flashed as men cut the ropes in sheer panic, sacrificing their comrades to save themselves. No one judged them. In that nightmare, morality had to bend to survival. Despite the failures, commanders continued searching for solutions. They proposed laying down barrels, ladders, even disassembled bridge sections. But every structure tested collapsed under the shifting, liquefied soil. The land was no longer land, it was a trap that adapted, consumed, erased, and every hour lost meant another barrage, another collapse, another soldier swallowed. Yet even as disaster piled upon disaster, one question haunted the front lines. If the terrain was this unstable, why did the enemy keep firing from positions so close to the quicksand zone? Why were they not sinking as well? Why were they able to maneuver while entire Allied units vanished with barely a fight? That question would be answered soon, when soldiers discovered that the enemy hadn't just adapted to the landscape, they had to weaponize it. What happened next defied every instinct a soldier relied on. Losing one man to the mud was horrifying. Losing a squad was unthinkable. But losing entire units, sometimes dozens of men at once, created a level of terror no battlefield manual had ever prepared them for. It began with patrol teams sent ahead to survey the unstable terrain. They walked cautiously into the fog, ropes tied around their waists, Heafleys, raised boots, sinking slightly with each step. Minutes later, the men holding the ropes felt a sudden, violent tug. Then another. Then the ropes went slack. When they pulled them back, they returned empty, frayed at the ends as if something below had shredded them apart. No screams, no gunfire, no signs of ambush, just disappearance. As word spread through the trenches, fear evolves into something darker. Seasoned veterans who had survived artillery barrages and bayonet charges now refused to step onto certain patches of ground. Some claimed they heard muffled cries beneath the surface, as if men buried alive were calling for help from impossible depths. Others swore they felt the earth vibrating rhythmically, like the beating of a massive heart beneath the mud. Rumors spread quickly. Soldiers whispered that the land itself was hungry, that it had tasted blood and wanted more. Then came the disappearance of an entire platoon during a night advance. They had been ordered to move silently under cover of darkness, following a narrow route believed to be stable. Lanterns were strictly forbidden, so they moved by touch and instinct, keeping formation in the pitch-black night. At first, everything seemed normal slow progress, quiet steps, whispered commands. But the men at the rear noticed something strange. The line ahead of them was getting shorter. The silhouettes were thinning out. Bit by bit, soldier by soldier, the formation dissolved as if the night itself were swallowing them. When dawn broke, only scattered equipment remained, half buried in mud, torn packs floating in puddles, and a single boot standing upright, its owner nowhere to be found. Fear mutated into paralysis. Some men refused to sleep, convinced that the ground beneath their dugouts would open while they rested. Others stood guard obsessively, staring at the darkened soil as though expecting it to rise up and strike. Officers tried to maintain control, but even they felt the strain. Strategic meetings were interrupted by sudden collapses in nearby trenches. Runners sent to relay messages vanished en route, leaving their dispatches soaking in mud. What truly shattered morale was when soldiers began sinking even in previously stable areas. The phenomenon was spreading. Engineers realized that repeated troop movements combined with constant bombardment were destabilizing the terrain far beyond the original zone. Safe ground was becoming scarce. The war front seemed alive, shifting, adapting, consuming. Letters recovered from this period reveal how deeply the terror penetrated the soldiers' minds. One wrote, "I would rather face 100 charging enemies than take one more step on that cursed earth." Another confessed, "The ground is haunted. It knows when we are weak. It waits." Yet the enemy continued firing from positions frighteningly close to the danger zone, as though they understood its boundaries in ways the Allied soldiers did not. Their artillery strikes were precise, often timed to trigger collapses at the exact moment to rescue. Attempts began. Their snipers targeted men stuck knee-deep, turning the mud into a slow-motion execution ground. It became clear the enemy was not merely surviving the terrain, they were manipulating it, using it as part of their strategy. And with each disappearance, each failed rescue, each eerie silence after the earth swallowed another man, the question grew heavier. How much of this was nature, and how much was a calculated tactic? That question would only deepen as the truth emerged from generals, but from the few shaken survivors who had seen the enemy's plan up close and lived long enough to report it. The turning point came when soldiers realized the enemy was no longer simply firing at them, they were orchestrating the battlefield itself, as if the mud were an extension of their arsenal. Observers began noticing patterns. Artillery shells didn't land randomly anymore. Instead, they were placed with eerie precision along the edges of unstable ground, striking exactly where the earth was most vulnerable. The explosions shook the liquefied layers beneath the surface, triggering collapses that swallowed entire squads before they even saw the enemy. It wasn't brute force. It was strategy. The opposing army had learned how to manipulate the living terrain into doing their killing for them. At first, Allied commanders refused to believe such coordination was possible. Mud, after all, was unpredictable. But unpredictability can become a weapon when someone understands its rhythms. And the enemy had spent months studying those rhythms. Scouts later confirmed that enemy engineers had mapped the terrain in meticulous detail, marking where bombardment had cracked the earth into unstable pockets. They positioned their trenches on higher, firmer ground, giving them a vantage point that allowed them to watch the Allies sink while they remained untouched. It was psychological warfare at its cruelest. watching your enemy drown not in water, but in the very soil they marched upon. Snipers soon joined the strategy. Instead of targeting officers or machines, they aimed at soldiers who were stuck men struggling knee-deep in the mire, desperately trying to pull themselves or comrades free. A single bullet turned a rescue mission into a massacre. Every attempt to move forward became a gamble. Save a man, and you might be shot. Abandon him, and you lost not just a soldier, but morale itself. In diaries later recovered, men described these moments as torture in slow motion, where every second felt like a moral test with no right answer. Then came the most chilling tactic of all: deliberate flooding. The enemy redirected small streams and drainage channels to feed water into already unstable zones. This wasn't improvisation, it was engineering. The added water increased soil liquefaction, expanding the lethal radius of the mud pits. Soldiers reported hearing the terrain change after each deliberate flood, the ground bubbling louder, the suction deepening. What was once passable in the morning became deadly by evening. The land itself seemed to be shifting allegiance. To make matters worse, the enemy used sound as a weapon. They coordinated barrages to land in rhythmic sequences that amplified vibrations underground, triggering collapses with terrifying precision. Soldiers described it as the earth shaking itself awake, reacting violently after each carefully timed strike. The enemy didn't need to advance. They just needed to wait for the ground to execute their plan. Some even suggested half. In fear, half in all that, the enemy had found a way to listen to the land, to anticipate its behavior like a hunter studying the movements of its prey. But the psychological blow was what truly devastated the Allies. Every time a man sank, the enemy cheered. From their elevated positions, they could watch whole formations dissolve, and their mocking laughter echoed across the battlefield. It wasn't just the loss of life, it was the humiliation. War thrives on dominance. And here, dominance came not from superior firepower, but from superior understanding of the terrain. The Allies tried to respond with counter-bombardments, but firing blindly into unstable ground only worsened the situation. Shells deepened the mud, widened the pits, and destroyed the last remnants of solid footing. Men joked bitterly that they were fighting two enemies: the army across the field and the earth beneath them. But it was no joke. The enemy's mastery of the terrain had turned mud into a tactical asset, silent, relentless, and merciless. What terrified the soldiers most was the realization that the enemy rarely ventured near the lethal zones themselves. They didn't need to. They let the land consume anyone who dared cross it. They had created a natural minefield that required no explosives, no maintenance, and no mercy. And yet, despite the horror, a few soldiers managed to survive long enough to witness how the enemy operated behind the scene. What they saw revealed a deeper truth. The enemy wasn't just using the mud, they were building a strategy around it. A strategy that would escalate in ways no one on the Allied side was prepared for. The men who volunteered or were ordered to perform rescue missions in the quicksand zone were not heroes in the way medals portray. They were terrified, exhausted, trembling humans who stepped into a nightmare knowing full well they might not return. No Juan envied them. No one wanted their job. But when a soldier disappeared into the mud screaming for help, instinct fought against reason, and comrades threw themselves forward, desperate to pull him out before the earth claimed him entirely. Every rescue attempt became a race against an invisible clock, a struggle not only against the mud's suction but against fierce, perilous grip. The rescue crews developed crude techniques. Through trial and mostly error. They tied ropes around their waists, forming human chains that in theory distributed weight safely. In practice, these chains often became death lines. When the ground collapsed beneath one man, the suction pulled the entire chain forward. More than one rescue attempt ended with 3 men sinking instead of 1. The horror of deciding whether to cut a rope severing a man to save the rest haunted survivors long after the war. Some wrote in their journals that the decision killed us more slowly than the mud ever did may attempted. To crawl on their stomachs to reduce pressure. But crawling only made them slower, more vulnerable to artillery, and more susceptible to the sudden collapses that opened beneath the surface. Like hidden jaws, others used wooden planks to distribute their weight, but the mud consumed those planks like it consumed everything else, swallowing them whole after mere minutes. There were reports of soldiers using discarded helmets as digging tools, scooping mud by the handful to free a trapped comrade, only to feel the ground vibrate beneath their elbows moments before another collapse. What made their rescues so devastating was the sound. The trapped soldiers didn't always scream. Sometimes they begged quietly, their voices trembling as the mud climbed up their chests. Other times, they cried out in animal panic as they felt themselves pulled downward. Rescuers heard their voices gurgle and fade as the mud reached their mouths. And when the mud swallowed them entirely, it made a soft, chilling sound like a breath being drawn inward, like the earth exhaling victory. The emotional weight crushed even the bravest men. Hardened sergeants broke down after losing entire rescue teams. Commanders had to assign fresh troops to rescue duties because veterans refused to go back into the zone. Some claimed they saw faces in the mud hallucinations created by stress and terror. Others believed the souls of the fallen were trapped below, waiting for someone to reach for them so the earth could claim another life. Yet, amidst the horror, moments of impossible courage emerged. One account described a soldier who tied his entire gear to a tree stump and used himself as an anchor to pull 3 men out before the mud nearly tore his arms from their sockets. Another story told of a rescue line that held longer than expected, not because of rope strength, but because a group of soldiers anchored themselves by locking arms and digging their heels into the last patch of solid ground. They saved 2 men that day. The third slipped beneath the mud just seconds before they reached him. But heroism carried a cost. Rescuers were prime targets for enemy snipers. The enemy, perched safely on elevated ground, waited for moments of chaos, men pulling, shouting, struggling, then fired into the crowd. A single sniper shot could turn a rescue attempt into a fatal chain reaction. One bullet might hit the anchorman, sending the entire line collapsing forward into the death zone. Soldiers described this as the cruelest tactic of all, being forced to choose between abandoning a sinking comrade or risking being gunned down while trying to save him. To make matters worse, artillery bombardments often landed mid. The enemy understood that the ground became exponentially deadlier when shaken. Shells exploded in rhythmic intervals, creating surges beneath the surface that accelerated collapses. Rescuers sometimes watched a soldier's torso vanish in seconds after a nearby detonation, loosened the soil beneath him. In those moments, the battlefield didn't feel like war. It felt like a slow-motion execution carried out jointly by the enemy and the earth. Even when rescue succeeded, the psychological scars remained. Survivors described the sensation of being pulled from the mud as if being reborn through terror. Many were unable to walk afterward, not because of injury, but because their legs trembled uncontrollably. Some refused to sleep, convinced that the mud would rise through the floorboards at night and dragged them down. Others could still feel the phantom suction around their ankles weeks later. Yet the most frightening part of these missions wasn't the mud, the suction, the artillery, or the snipers. It was the dawning realization that the enemy seemed to know exactly when and where these rescue attempts would occur. They anticipated them with uncanny accuracy, and that unsettling awareness hinted at a much darker truth, one that would soon unravel. Everything the Allies thought they understood about the battlefield. For the soldiers trapped in that nightmare, the mud felt supernatural, selective, almost intelligent. It spared some men entirely while devouring others within seconds. But the truth behind this horror wasn't mystical. It was scientific, mechanical, and far more chilling because of how indifferent it was to human life. The battlefield had become a complex system of pressure, saturation, and collapsing soil structures, where each footstep triggered reactions beneath the surface that not even trained engineers could fully predict. When artillery hammered the landscape, it didn't simply churn the ground, it liquefied it. Each explosion broke apart the soil's internal bonds, creating pockets of semi-fluid earth beneath a deceptively solid crust. To a soldier on the surface, the ground might appear firm, even supportive, but beneath that thin layer lay a zone of near-liquid sediment waiting to collapse under the right. A mound of weight. One man stepping lightly might pass safely, but the next man, perhaps heavier, carrying more gear, or stepping only inches to the left, could plunge instantly into a hidden void. It all came down to pressure distribution. The mud behaved like a trap that responded differently depending on the angle, force, and timing of each movement. If a soldier shifted his weight suddenly, the crust beneath him could buckle, creating a downward suction that acted like a vacuum. The moment the surface broke, water rushed upward to fill the void, dragging the soldier down with terrifying speed. The more he struggled, the faster he sank. Panic increased body weight distribution, accelerating the collapse. The battlefield became a living equation, one that punished even the slightest miscalculation. Scientists who studied survivors' accounts noted another factor: soil shear strength. In normal terrain, soil resists movement, but in this liquefied battlefield, that strength had nearly vanished. It took very little force for the ground to give way. Men with narrow stances were more likely to sink. Those who landed with their feet too close together created pressure points strong enough to rupture the soil. A single misstep could determine life or death, and yet the randomness wasn't entirely random. Patterns emerged. Engineers realized that areas with high clay content absorbed water differently, forming pockets that acted like underwater balloons. Some of these balloons could support dozens of footsteps, and a single one punctured the layer and sent everything collapsing. Soldiers described the sensation as stepping onto a drumhead moments before it tore open. The enemy, unbelievably, had learned to detect these pressure zones. They watched how the ground behaved under troop movement, identifying where the crust bulged slightly or where water seeped upward in thin trickles. These signs, to a trained observer, revealed where collapses were imminent. When the enemy targeted those spots with artillery, they weren't aiming to kill directly, they were aiming to break the ground beneath Allied soldiers and let nature finish the job. It was warfare executed with geological precision. Weight also played a crucial role. A soldier might survive crossing a deadly patch of terrain until he tried to lift a sinking comrade. The added weight was enough to breach the crust, causing both men to collapse into this cruel reality forced rescuers to make impossible decisions. Drop your gear and risk exposure to enemy fire, or keep it and risk being dragged under. Each choice carried a different kind of death. Even equipment placement mattered. Helmets, rifles, and packs, falling on the mud, sometimes floated, sometimes vanished instantly, depending on where they landed. This inconsistency tormented the soldiers. They could not predict the ground's behavior. Each step became an experiment with stakes higher than life itself. Then came the most unsettling discovery. Certain soil pockets stored explosive potential energy tension, created by the weight of layered mud pressing downward. When disturbed, these pockets didn't just collapse, they erupted. Soldiers reported seeing geysers of mud shoot upward as the ground inverted, pulling men downward while exploding outward. To the trapped soldiers, these eruptions felt like the earth was spitting upward in rage while dragging downward in hunger. And yet, amidst all this terror, a single truth emerged that changed the course of the battlefield. The terrain was not killing randomly. It was responding to stress, movement, sound, and force. The enemy understood this. The Allies did not, least not yet. But once engineers began mapping these deadly zones, once they realized the ground obeyed certain physical rules, a new possibility emerged. Perhaps the mud could be predicted, or even avoided. At first, the generals dismissed the reports. Mud-swallowing soldiers, entire platoons, vanishing without direct enemy engagement. Two commanders who operated miles from the front lines. These stories sounded like exaggerations from exhausted men, but the evidence grew impossible to ignore. Casualty lists expanded with horrifying notes. No remains recovered, presumed drowned in terrain, lost to ground collapse. The battlefield was devouring their forces faster than enemy fire ever could. And finally, the high command was forced to confront a truth no military manual had prepared them for. The landscape itself had become the dominant belief. The turning point came during a scheduled offensive. Dozens of battalions were arranged to charge across what maps still identified as firm ground. But when observers scanned the field through binoculars at dawn, what they saw instead was a glistening expanse of shifting brown, a battlefield that looked less like soil and more like a living organism pulsing with its own agenda. Before a single whistle blew, parts of the advance line were already sinking. Men attempted to reposition to more stable ground, but the mud extended farther than any map had ever shown. It stretched outward in unpredictable patterns, swallowing previous pathways, consuming landmarks, turning familiar terrain into something unrecognizable. Higher-ranking officers rode forward to inspect the situation themselves, an unusual and desperate gesture. Their horses sank up to their knees within seconds. Some animals panicked, thrashing violently before collapsing, their riders thrown clear. It was the first time the generals saw with their own eyes what their soldiers had been trying to put into words. This was not terrain. This was quicksand disguised as a battlefield, transformed by bombardment into something capable of outmaneuvering human strategy. When they retreated back to the command post, the atmosphere shifted from disbelief to panic. Maps became meaningless. Formations became impossible. Supply routes vanished. Overnight, every plan requiring troop movement collapsed under the weight of a single truth. You cannot maneuver an army over ground that refuses to support human weight. Officers debated fiercely. Should they attempt to flank the unstable zone? Impossible. The instability stretched 4 miles. Should they reinforce with wooden tracks? Tests showed the mud swallowed those as quickly as men. Should they retreat? Retreat meant crossing the same deadly earth that had already claimed hundreds. Engineers offered explanations steeped in science: soil liquefaction, hydrostatic pressure, saturated layers collapsing under weight. But while the science was sound, it did nothing to solve the immediate crisis. Commanders required certainty, stable ground, predictable conditions, a definable enemy. Here, they had none of that. Their opponent was a mutating environment that responded dynamically to pressure, movement, and bombardment. The generals had no strategy for fighting the earth itself. Meanwhile, the enemy capitalized on every moment of hesitation. Their artillery targeted the edges of unstable zones with uncanny accuracy. Their infantry stayed firmly on elevated ridges, untouched by artillery churn. They waited patiently, strategically knowing the Allies could not move without losing men to the ground. For the first time in the campaign, the enemy didn't need to attack. They just needed to watch as the opposing army struggled against nature's invisible grip. Reports reached high command, describing scenes of pure chaos. Stretcher bearers sinking while trying to retrieve the wounded, ammunition cuts swallowed whole, entire communication units cut off because messengers vanished en route, trenches collapsed inward, burying soldiers alive in liquefied soil. Machine gun nests disappeared in minutes when their platforms softened beneath them. Officers wrote frantic notes pleading for new orders, but no new orders came because no one knew what to do. The war had entered a phase no strategist had predicted, a stalemate created not by rival armies, but by geological collapse. And yet, despite the catastrophe, the campaign could not simply be abandoned. Political pressure demanded progress. Military pride demanded perseverance, but deep down, some officers began to fear a darker possibility, that advancing across this terrain was not merely impossible, it was suicidal. Long after the guns fell silent, the mud still haunted the men who survived it. Their nightmares weren't of artillery or bayonets or the enemy charging through smoke. Their nightmares were of watching the ground swallow their friends alive slowly, silently, without reason. The horrors they carried home were not the quick deaths of combat, but the drawn-out terror of helplessness, the sound of voices fading beneath the earth, the sight of hands reaching upward before disappearing forever. One survivor described it as the quietest form of death I've ever seen. He wrote that the mud made no roar, no thunderous, impotently, a soft gurgling noise as it wrapped itself around a man's chest, then his throat, then his mouth. Another man recalled how a comrade begged him not to let go, gripping his wrist so tightly that the survivor carried the bruises for months. But the mud pulled harder. He remembered the exact moment when the finger slipped away. It felt like failing someone in slow motion, he wrote. And it keeps happening in my sleep. These testimonies shared a common theme. The sinking was never sudden. It was agonizingly gradual. Men had time to scream, to fight, to plead with their comrades, and the survivors had time to hope, then to despair as the earth consumed the trapped soldier inch by inch. The psychological toll of witnessing such deaths left wounds deeper than shrapnel ever could. Soldiers lost not just comrades, but their belief that the battlefield obeyed any rules at all. For many, the worst moments came when the mud refused to release the dead body that should have been buried with honor, simply vanished. There were no graves to visit, no remains to recover, no markers to commemorate the fallen. Families received letters explaining that their sons were lost to terrain collapse, a phrase so unnatural that it barely conveyed the horror behind it. Survivors wrote back, trying to describe what had happened, but no words could truly capture the sensation of watching the earth itself become an executioner. Some soldiers developed rituals too. Cope. They whispered apologies into the mud. They avoided stepping on certain patches of ground, convinced the spirits of the lost lingered beneath. Others refused to speak of it at all. Silence became their armor, but silence offered no escape. Many returned home only to relive the battlefield every time they stepped onto soft soil. Riverbanks, even wet streets after rain. Their legs would tense, their bodies freeze, their breathing quicken. The ground had trained them to fear what lay beneath. Then there were the men who had been pulled from the mud themselves. Their testimonies were some of the most unsettling. They described the suffocating pressure as their bodies sank, the way the mud seemed to compress their chests so they couldn't breathe. They remembered the darkness closing in as the muck climbed toward their faces, the muffled thuds of artillery sounding like distant echoes, as if they had already been buried alive. One survivor wrote, "You don't feel like you're dying. You feel like you're being claimed." Some spoke of hallucinations, visions of hands reaching for them from below, whispers rising through the muck. Psychologists dismissed these as stressed responses, but soldiers insisted the battlefield had changed them in ways science couldn't explain. They felt they had crossed a boundary, not just between life and death, but between the world above and something far more primal beneath it. But perhaps the most chilling testimonies came from survivors who claimed they heard sinking men even after the ground had swallowed them, entirely muffled cries, faint pounding, desperate attempts to breathe through the thick earth. Engineers denied this was possible. Their men knew what they heard. The trauma didn't fade when the war ended. Many drank heavily to silence the memories. Others avoided open fields for the rest of their lives. Some refused to speak of the war at all until, in old age, the memories finally broke through their defenses, spilling out in fragmented stories filled with trembling hands and long pauses. But one detail appeared again and again in their accounts. It wasn't the horror of mud as a natural force that haunted them most. It was the knowledge that the enemy had understood the terrain better than they had, that the enemy had watched them sink, that the enemy had planned for it. There came a morning when the guns fell silent, not because of an armistice, not because commanders sought peace, but because neither army dared take a single step onto the battlefield. The terrain had transformed into something so volatile, so unpredictable, that even the most hardened soldiers refused to advance. The mud no longer behaved like soil. It had become a shifting, heaving surface that seemed to pulse with each distant explosion, inhaling and exhaling as though it had developed a will of its own. Fog clung to the ground in heavy sheets, hiding the subtle movements of the earth beneath, creating the illusion that the battlefield was sleeping. But everyone on both sides knew the truth. The ground wasn't sleeping. It was waiting. In the Allied trenches, officers attempted to rally their men for a planned attack. But no amount of shouting, pleading, or threats could move them. Soldiers stared at the field with hollow eyes, gripping their rifles tightly, as if the weapons could protect them from the very land beneath their feet. Scouts who had ventured out at dawn returned shaking uncontrollably, reporting that the once solid paths had liquefied overnight, that pools of water now churned in strange circular patterns, and that even the wind carried the stench of disturbed earth. No one wanted to be the first to step forward. No one wanted to become another name swallowed without trace. Across the battlefield, the enemy faced the same paralysis. They too had watched the terrain consume their foes, and at times their own men with terrifying efficiency. They had used the mud as a weapon, but even they no longer trusted it. Their engineers reported cases where previously safe ridges had begun to slump inward, the underlying soil destabilized by weeks of bombardment. Snipers refused to take new positions. Artillery crews hesitated to move their guns. In one documented case, an entire battery vanished when the slope beneath them collapsed, dragging cannons and men into a newly formed sinkhole that sealed itself within minutes. The enemy realized they were no longer in control of the land they had weaponized. For the first time in the campaign, both armies simply watched each other. Through binoculars and rifle scopes, they observed silhouettes standing motionless in trenches that grew more fragile by the hour. They listened to the eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional groan of shifting mud or the distant rumble of earth. Collapsing somewhere out of sight, officers on both sides sensed something unprecedented. A stalemate enforced not by human strategy, but by the terrain's growing hostility. Then something extraordinary happened. Reports emerged of enemy soldiers waving white close knots in surrender. But as a warning, they gestured frantically toward sections of ground that had begun to ripple as if something massive were moving beneath the surface. The Allies saw it too. Areas that had been stable the day before now bulged upward in slow motion, like the earth was swelling with trapped air. When the swell finally ruptured, a thick column of mud shot into the air, raining slurry over the landscape. The explosion was not caused by artillery. It came from the land itself. Terrified soldiers on both sides backed away from their trench edges, suddenly aware they were witnessing a battlefield devouring itself. High command had no options left. Orders became meaningless. Plans dissolved. The war, at least in this sector, had reached a point where nature dictated the next move, and nature had declared the battlefield off. In a rare moment of shared survival instinct, both armies withdrew simultaneously, not as adversaries, but as organisms fleeing an environment that had turned carnivorous. Men stumbled back across makeshift walkways, carrying wounded comrades and abandoning equipment too heavy to move. Horses panicked and bolted. Officers did not shout. No one needed to. The earth was giving its own orders now. By dusk, the field stood empty. No footsteps disturbed the sludge. No shells exploded. No rifles cracked. The only movement was the slow, deliberate shifting of the ground, as if the battlefield were settling after a feast. Soldiers watching from distant ridges later described the scene as the quietest apocalypse imaginable. A war that paused not because humans chose restraint, but because the earth had forced them to acknowledge its dominance. And in the aftermath, when the land finally stabilized weeks later, the battlefield revealed almost nothing. No bodies, no weapons, no wreckage, just a smooth, rippled surface, like the skin of a creature that had swallowed too much and needed time to digest. Both armies moved on, but the survivors carried with them a truth their commanders refused to record. The war had not stopped because of strategy. It had stopped because the battlefield itself had won. And that realization raised the final question none of them dared to say aloud. If the earth could decide when a war ended, could it also decide when one began? If you stayed with this story until the end, you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive. So before you go, make sure you subscribe to the channel. This helps us bring more forgotten military secrets back to the surface. Also, leave a comment saying, "The ground remembers." It lets me know you reached the final moment of this story. And don't forget to leave a like, because it tells the algorithm this kind of deep historical storytelling deserves to be seen. Now, go watch the next video that's appearing on your screen. There's another hidden chapter of military history waiting for you there.